Hello there, weary traveller, and welcome to this cozy corner of history. Before we begin our journey back to the brutal winters of medieval times, I wanted to extend a warm greeting to you, dear listener. Whether you're nestled under the covers, ready to drift off to sleep, or simply looking to unwind with some quiet, historical storytelling, I'm so glad you've chosen to join me tonight. If you don't mind, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. It's always such a delight to see the diverse community of history enthusiasts gathered here. And if you enjoy this style of calm, immersive tales from the past, go ahead and click that subscribe button so you don't miss the next installment. But for now, let's allow the stresses of the modern world to melt away as we travel back to a time long ago when winter's icy grip held far more peril than most of us could imagine. A time when the changing of the seasons brought not just inconvenience, but genuine fear for survival. Picture yourself in the countryside of medieval Europe. The last leaves have long since fallen from the trees, and the sun hangs low on the horizon, its weak rays doing little to warm the biting chill in the air. Frosty fields crunch underfoot as a breeze carries the first few flurries of snow. Winter is coming, and for the people of this age, that means one thing above all: hardship. The cold seeps in slowly at first, but it will linger for long months to come. The landscape will soon be blanketed in white, the rivers and ponds freezing over into gleaming sheets of ice. In a time before central heating and well-insulated homes, the promise of warmth is a distant dream for all but the wealthiest. But of course, it wasn't always like this. Medieval winters were not always so brutal, so unforgiving. There was a time when the seasons passed in a more predictable rhythm, when the arrival of snow was met with acceptance rather than dread. But then, something changed. The climate itself began to shift, ushering in a period that would come to be known as the Little Ice Age. Lasting from the 14th century all the way into the 19th, the Little Ice Age brought colder temperatures and harsher winters than anyone could remember. The reasons for this change are still not fully understood, but its impact was felt across the land. Crops failed, livestock perished, and the icy winds blew ever harder. One of the most famous examples of the Little Ice Age's fury was the Great Frost of 1709. That winter, temperatures plummeted so low that rivers and lakes froze solid. In London, the River Thames became a frozen highway, with people setting up shop and even lighting fires right on the ice. It was a surreal sight, but one that came at a cost. Many perished from the cold that year, huddled in their homes as the world outside turned to ice. But amidst all the suffering, there were some who found a strange sort of solace in the frigid weather. One such figure was a young Isaac Newton, then a student at the University of Cambridge. When the Great Frost hit, Newton was forced to return home to his family's farm. There, huddled by the fire, he found himself with ample time to ponder the mysteries of the universe. It was during this unexpected break that Newton began to develop some of his most groundbreaking ideas, laying the foundations for his theories on calculus and optics. Who knows what other great minds might have been sparked to brilliance by the quiet isolation of a long, cold winter. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit has a way of seeking out the light. But for the vast majority of people in medieval times, winter was a season to be endured rather than enjoyed. The rich could afford thick woolen clothing, ample firewood, and well-stocked larders to see them through the lean months. But for the peasants and serfs who made up the bulk of the population, it was a very different story. Imagine waking up each morning in a one-room cottage, the air thick with smoke from the sputtering fire. Your breath mists in front of you as you rise from your straw mattress, careful not to disturb the shivering forms of your family members huddled around you for warmth. The cold seeps in through every crack and crevice, numbing your fingers and toes until they ache. Breakfast, if you're lucky, might be a meager bowl of porridge or some stale bread. The food from the previous harvest is beginning to run low, and you know that the long winter months will only bring more scarcity. The livestock too are suffering, their coats matted with frost as they huddle together in the barn, their breath steaming in the icy air. As the day wears on, you trudge out into the snow to gather what firewood you can. It's backbreaking work, and your hands quickly become raw and chapped from the cold. But you know that without a fire, your family will not survive the night. You think of your children, their small faces pinched with hunger and cold, and you press on. This was the reality for so many in medieval times. A constant battle against the elements, a fight for survival that consumed every waking hour. And yet, even in the face of such hardship, there were moments of resilience and even joy to be found. You see, the medieval world was one deeply attuned to the rhythms of nature. The passing of the seasons was marked not just by changes in the weather, but by a rich tapestry of rituals and celebrations. And so, even in the depths of winter, there were glimmers of light to be found. One such beacon was the midwinter feast of St. Stephen, held each year on December 26th. For a brief moment, the rigid social hierarchies of medieval society were turned on their head, with a peasant or serf being crowned the lord of misrule for the day. This lucky individual would preside over a raucous celebration filled with food, drink, and revelry, a rare moment of indulgence in an otherwise austere existence. But perhaps the most enduring symbol of hope in the medieval winter was the simple act of coming together. In a world where survival often depended on the strength of one's community, the bonds of family and friendship took on a profound importance. Imagine, if you will, a small village huddled against the snow. The smoke from the chimneys mingles with the leaden sky, a sign of life amidst the barren landscape. Inside the homes, families crowd together around the hearth, telling stories and sharing what meager scraps of food they have. There is a sense of unity here, a shared sense of purpose in the face of hardship. Neighbors trudge through the snow to check on each other, bringing extra firewood or a pot of stew to those in need. In the flickering firelight, faces are lined with weariness, but also with a quiet determination. They have survived winters past, and they will survive this one too. And so the long, cold months march on, the snow piling higher and the ice growing thicker with each passing day. But even in the darkest depths of winter, there is a glimmer of hope on the horizon. For the people of medieval times knew that no matter how brutal the season, spring would come again. They watched for the first signs with a keen and practiced eye. The slight lengthening of the days, the softening of the earth beneath the snow. And when at last the thaw began, it was celebrated with a joy and reverence that we can scarcely imagine today. Plough Monday marked the official end of the winter season, a day when work in the fields could begin anew. The ploughs that had lain idle for so long were brought out and blessed in elaborate ceremonies, a symbol of the renewed cycle of life. As the first furrows were cut into the earth, there was a palpable sense of relief and gratitude in the air. Life had been hard, yes, bitterly hard at times, but they had endured. Through the long dark of winter, through the hunger and the cold and the gnawing uncertainty, the people of medieval Europe had held fast to the promise of spring. And now, as the land began to thaw and green shoots pushed their way towards the sun, that promise was fulfilled. It's a resilience that is hard to fathom in our modern age of convenience and comfort. The idea of facing such relentless hardship year after year is almost unimaginable. And yet, there is something deeply humbling in the knowledge that our ancestors did just that. They faced the brutal reality of their world with a strength and fortitude that is nothing short of remarkable. They found hope in the darkest of times and joy in the simplest of things. And in doing so, they left us a legacy of resilience that echoes down through the ages. So the next time you find yourself shivering on a cold winter's day, take a moment to remember those who came before. Remember their struggles and their triumphs, their sorrow and their joy. And above all, remember the unbreakable human spirit that carried them through even the harshest of winters. Because in the end, that is perhaps the greatest lesson we can learn from the medieval world. That no matter how dark the night or how cold the wind, the promise of spring is always waiting just around the corner. And with that, dear listener, we come to the end of our journey through the brutal winters of medieval Europe. I hope that these tales of hardship and resilience have brought a new perspective to your own experiences of the season. May you always find warmth and comfort in the bonds of family and community, just as our ancestors did so long ago. And may the promise of spring light your way through even the coldest of nights. Thank you for joining me on this cozy corner of history. And remember, if you enjoyed our time together tonight, I'd love it if you'd subscribe and share these stories with a friend. There are so many more fascinating tales to explore together. But for now, I'll bid you a fond good night. Stay warm, stay safe, and I'll see you next time for another journey into the past. Sweet dreams. As the brutal conditions of winter tightened their icy grip on medieval society, even the most privileged were not immune to the season's merciless onslaught. In drafty, primitive castles ill-equipped for the harshest months, royal households faced a formidable challenge in staving off the biting cold and keeping the court adequately provisioned. The logistics of maintaining a royal residence during winter were nothing short of staggering. Massive quantities of firewood needed to be stockpiled to fuel the roaring hearths that provided the only source of heat. The kitchen staff toiled ceaselessly to preserve meats, grains, and vegetables that would sustain the court through the long, lean months when fresh fare was scarce. Servitors scrambled to seal every crack and gap to keep out the insidious chill. But even the most diligent preparations often proved insufficient against winter's relentless assault. In one particularly chilling tale, a medieval queen is said to have tragically perished from exposure within her own palace walls. According to chroniclers, Queen Elizabeth of Hungary was found frozen in her bed one bitter January morning in 1326, a victim of the very castle that was meant to be her refuge. As grim fates like these demonstrate, the spectre of death cast its ominous pall over the medieval world in winter's dark depths. But even amidst such bleakness, the indomitable human spirit endured and found cause to rekindle hope. For much of the populace, that faint glimmer came in the form of the Feast of St. Stephen, a cherished midwinter celebration falling on December 26th. This day marked a brief respite from the unending drudgery and privation of peasant life, a rare sanctioned opportunity for revelry and indulgence. Central to the feast was the tradition of misrule, a ceremonial inversion of the normal social order. For this single day, a commoner would be appointed the Lord of Misrule, granted temporary authority to preside over the merriment and issue playful edicts to his betters. However fleeting, this act of Saturnalian license provided a vital pressure valve for the simmering tensions and resentments bred by the oppressive feudal hierarchy. The rigid lines between lord and vassal blurred for one mirth-filled day, where all could partake as equals in the feasting, gaming, and carousing. The sense of community fostered by such celebrations was more than mere diversion. It was a critical survival mechanism. With winter's cruelty threatening to break both body and spirit, the bonds of fellowship and goodwill forged during the Feast of Stephen and similar revelries helped sustain the populace through the leanest times. One chronicle from 1377 recounts the poignant tale of two peasant families, neighbours whose meagre winter stores had been exhausted long before spring's arrival. On the verge of perishing from hunger, they pooled the last of their tattered resources to share a humble meal on the feast of St. Stephen. That gesture of generosity and unity gave them the strength to endure the season's remaining ravages. Such acts of compassion formed the very marrow of medieval society in winter, when a helping hand extended to a frostbitten traveller or an extra log given to a shivering widow could spell the difference between life and death. The grim shared purpose of weathering winter's onslaught together shaped a culture of interdependence that defied the era's often ruthless stratification. But even the warmest expressions of conviviality and fellow feeling inevitably cooled as winter's unrelenting misery stretched on interminably. The Feast of Stephen was but a small flare of light and levity amidst the frozen darkness, a momentary reprieve before the bleak slog of January, February, and March. As stores dwindled, bellies hungered, and the cold crept past the most assiduously stoked hearth, the faint promise of distant spring seemed to fade into impossibility. And yet, year after arduous year, medieval society endured against all odds. Through unimaginable adversity and hardship, they clung to existence, upheld by the grit, fortitude, and fellowship forged in winter's unsparing crucible. As the land lay dormant and the sun retreated, they somehow found within themselves the tenacity to carry on. One can only imagine the flood of profound relief and joy that greeted the first tentative signs of winter's passing. The slight softening of the frigid air, the incremental lengthening of daylight, the hopeful drip of icicles yielding to the sun's strengthening rays. After months of unremitting struggle, the sight of the season's initial lost battles against the forces of light and life must have seemed nothing short of miraculous. For the battle-weary tillers of the earth, no day was more welcome than Plough Monday, the traditional start of the agricultural year. Falling on the first Monday after Epiphany in early January, it heralded the ground's imminent thawing and reawakening. Though the deepest rigours of winter had yet to fully release their stranglehold, the ritual preparations of Plough Monday offered a tangible talisman of hope, an assurance of winter's inevitable loosening and spring's fecund return. One can picture a patchwork of furrowed fields slowly emerging from the receding snows and frosts. The newly harnessed draft teams leaning into the first tentative overturning of the frigid clods. With each sod upended to greet the strengthening sun, medieval man dealt another blow to winter's retreating sovereignty and proclaimed his dogged persistence in the face of nature's caprice. We in the modern world, with our central heat and electric blankets, our well-stocked larders and resilient infrastructure, can scarcely fathom the immense fortitude required to endure the unremitting brutality of a medieval winter. If the season's impositions seem daunting to us now, from the cozy remove of our temperature-controlled bubbles, how incomprehensible must true winter suffering be? And yet, when we grumble about the minor inconveniences of a delayed flight or a rain-snarled commute, perhaps we would do well to reflect on the unyielding misery experienced by our forebears during those interminable frozen months. What reserves of resilience and tenacity they were forced to draw upon, year after arduous year, simply to survive. Their ability to eke out moments of celebration and fellowship amid such unrelenting privation seems nearly superhuman to modern sensibilities. That they not only withstood winter's ravages, but managed to find slivers of light in the all-encompassing darkness is a testament to the indomitable spirit that slumbers within us all, waiting to be roused by hardship's clarion call. So the next time we feel our modern discontents starting to chafe, perhaps we would do well to cast our minds back to the icy plights of our predecessors. In remembrance of those who came before, let us embrace the opportunity to tap into our own dormant reserves of grit and forbearance. And as we nestle gratefully into our warm beds, let us spare a thought for all those who fought winter's bitter siege, armed only with the weapons of will, fellowship, and undying hope. As the new year dawned and Plough Monday festivities faded into memory, medieval life settled back into its familiar winter rhythm. Short, frigid days and long, frosty nights were the hallmarks of the season. The fortunate retreated to the meagre warmth of smoky hovels and draughty manors. For the less privileged, winter meant a constant battle against the elements just to survive. One of the greatest winter hardships was the ever-present threat of sickness. In the cramped and unsanitary living conditions of the time, disease could spread like wildfire. The common cold was an uncommon misery, leaving sufferers red-nosed and bleary-eyed. But far more serious illnesses also stalked the populace. Influenza was a fearsome foe, striking down young and old alike with its telltale fever, chills, and aches. In an age without vaccines or effective treatments, flu outbreaks could decimate entire communities. The winter of 1557 was particularly brutal, with a virulent strain of influenza raging across Europe. In Paris alone, over 10,000 souls perished. Pneumonia was another stealthy killer, preying on those weakened by hunger or other illnesses. The winter dampness seeped into the lungs, causing them to fill with fluid until the victim essentially drowned. Crowded living spaces provided the perfect breeding ground for pneumonia to run rampant. It was not unusual for multiple members of the same family to succumb, leaving orphaned children and shattered lives in its wake. Even royalty was not spared the ravages of winter sickness. In fact, disease often spread even more rapidly in castles and courts due to the constant flow of people in and out. A visiting dignitary or pilgrim might unknowingly bring pestilence along with their entourage. Henry VIII lost his beloved wife Jane Seymour to postnatal complications likely exacerbated by the poor hygienic practices of the age. Children were perhaps the most vulnerable of all. Harsh weather, meager rations, and unsanitary conditions combined to make winter a truly dangerous time for the young. Infants born in the cold months faced an especially precarious start to life. In London in the 1500s, fully half of all children did not survive to see their 5th birthday. One poignant practice of the age speaks volumes. The custom of bone lace involved tying a black ribbon to the hand of a seriously ill infant. Should the child pass away, this ribbon could then be used to secure their burial shroud, a somber reminder of winter's deadly toll on the most innocent. With danger lurking both outside the home and within, winter was a time to batten down the hatches and pray for survival. For those of limited means, even the basic comforts of shelter, food, and warmth could not be taken for granted. The icy grip of winter poverty was relentless and pitiless. Firewood was a precious commodity, with strict laws governing the gathering of fallen timbers from forests. A peasant family might huddle around a makeshift fire of dried dung and straw, striving to eke out some feeble warmth. Shivering livestock shared what heat there was, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Food supplies dwindled to a meager subsistence of salted meat, dried peas, and coarse bread. The autumn harvest bounty was a distant memory, and the first shy greenery of spring was still months away. Foraging for winter nutrients meant scouring the stark landscape for hardy fare, like nettles, garlic, and mushrooms. The scarcity of fresh vegetables in winter made for some very dreary dinner pots. A typical pottage might contain peas, beans, salted pork, and, if lucky, some foraged greens and wild onions for flavour. Tasteless and tedious, but enough to keep body and soul together until spring. For many, even this unappealing monotony was an unattainable luxury. Storms, droughts, pests, and other calamities could obliterate food stores, plunging entire regions into crisis. The Great Famine of 1315 was a particularly harrowing time, caused by relentlessly heavy rains that rotted crops in the fields across northern Europe. Contemporary accounts paint a chilling picture of desperate people reduced to eating dogs, horses, and even human flesh in their hunger. Parents were said to have smothered their starving children as an act of mercy. Corpses littered the streets and fields, too numerous for proper burial. Although this famine was remarkable for its severity and scale, localized crop failures and food shortages were an ever-present menace. A medieval winter diet walked a tightrope between subsistence and starvation. It was a time of hunkering down with the knowledge that things would likely get worse before they got better. Beyond basic survival, winter affected every facet of medieval culture. Leisure, religious worship, and even crime and punishment took on the unmistakable stamp of the season. The sheer drudgery of scratching out an existence in the bitter cold coloured all aspects of life. Socially, winter was a time of drawing in and relying on the bonds of family and community. The cheery gatherings around the Yule log gave way to more sedate pursuits. With travel treacherous and daylight scarce, people looked inward for amusement and enrichment during the long, dark evenings. Telling stories and singing songs helped to while away the hours. The flickering light of rushlights or tallow candles illuminated scenes of sewing, weaving, and whittling. With idle hands seen as the devil's playground, industriousness was more necessity than virtue. Winter's confinement at least provided ample time for such gainful activities. For the literate, winter offered a chance to curl up with a good book, although this was a rather exclusive club. In England, at the close of the 15th century, a humble tradesman's library might boast a Bible, a book of hours, and perhaps some merry jests or tales of Robin Hood. Only the wealthy could afford the lavishly illuminated volumes so prized by bibliophiles. Those who could read often did so aloud for the benefit and entertainment of the whole household. Winter was a time for sharing treasured stories of brave knights, canny tricksters, and star-crossed lovers. The chivalric adventures of King Arthur and his court were perennial favourites, their intricate plots and noble themes helping to transport listeners far beyond the close confines of their winter refuge. Less wholesome entertainments also served to liven up the tedium of winter days. Gambling with dice was a popular pastime, often leading to heated tempers and empty purses. The clatter of knucklebones and the rattle of dice would ring out in many a tavern and great hall as fortunes were won and lost. Drink was another common winter diversion, the fermented comforts of ale, mead, and wine helping to boost both body temperature and spirits. Public houses saw a roaring trade, offering fellowship, entertainment, and an escape from the bitter cold. Inebriation often led to looser tongues and lower inhibitions, sparking lively debates, bawdy songs, and occasionally a brawl or two. The short, dark days of winter also lent themselves to quiet reflection and spiritual contemplation. The church held great sway in the medieval mind, and winter was a time for drawing closer to God. With agricultural work at a lull, more time could be devoted to prayer, penance, and good works. The traditional nativity plays and pageants of Christmastide gave way to more somber devotions as winter deepened. The pious might undertake pilgrimages to holy sites, braving the harsh conditions as a sign of their commitment and devotion. Others spent hours in hushed churches, fingering rosary beads numb with cold and meditating on their eternal soul. Charity was also an important winter value, with almsgiving seen as a Christian duty. The 7 acts of corporal mercy laid out a blueprint for generosity, feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, sheltering the homeless, clothing the naked, visiting prisoners, comforting the sick, and burying the dead. In a season of scarcity and hardship, small gestures of human kindness could make all the difference. Of course, winter's harshness sometimes brought out the worst in human nature as well. Crime tended to rise as desperation set in and opportunities for theft increased. With people spending more time indoors in close quarters, tempers often frayed, leading to a spike in assaults and other violent crimes. The medieval justice system was ill-equipped to deal with this seasonal surge in lawlessness. Trials were often delayed until the weather improved, leaving the accused to languish in dank and overcrowded jails. Punishments could be harsh, with fines, floggings, and even executions meted out to those found guilty. But even in the face of winter's bleak realities, the indomitable human spirit endured. People found small joys and moments of levity where they could. The distant promise of spring sustained them through the darkest and coldest nights. The lengthening days of February brought a welcome reprieve with the feast of St. Valentine on the 14th. This ancient pagan fertility rite, Christianized into a celebration of love, was enthusiastically embraced by the people of the Middle Ages. It was a bright spot of warmth and tenderness in the very heart of winter's depths. The custom of drawing names for Valentine's sweethearts was well established by the 15th century. Eligible ladies and lads would gather to draw slips of paper from a bowl, sealing their romantic fate for the next year. These annual pairings often led to merry flirtations and sometimes even marriages. Flowers, sweets, and sentimental verses were common tokens of affection exchanged between Valentine's sweethearts. The simple act of receiving a handmade card from an admirer could set hearts aflutter, even in the chilliest weather. Winter, for all its woes, could not freeze the fires of love. As the feast of St. Valentine passed into Lent, the austerities of the season intensified. But there was a sense that the worst was now behind and brighter days lay ahead. The snowdrops and crocuses poking their fragile heads through the frost offered tangible evidence that winter's icy reign was finally weakening. Throughout the Middle Ages, the relentless cycle of the seasons shaped every aspect of life, and no season stamped its mark more firmly than winter. It was a time of privation and hardship, when mere survival was an achievement. And yet, it was also a time of resilience and quiet fortitude in the face of the harshest of elements. Medieval winter was a test of the human spirit, a proving ground for the values of faith, family, and community. The winking icicles, frosty meadows, and long fallow fields may have been a postcard-perfect scene, but the realities of the season were anything but picturesque. However, this crucible of snow and ice and want also forged a people of remarkable grit and endurance. The Middle Ages were built on the backs of those who could weather the very worst that winter had to offer and still find a reason to hope for spring. There is perhaps no greater tribute to their stubborn vitality. So the next time you find yourself bemoaning a delayed train or a slushy sidewalk, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors. Unequipped with thermal socks, central heating, or weather apps, they faced each winter as a battle to be fought with every resource at their disposal. And they emerged victorious, spring after spring. We are the heirs and beneficiaries of their tenacity and unbreakable spirit. And with that, I will leave you to your warm bed and electric blanket, secure in the knowledge that winter has been largely tamed, thanks in no small part to those who came before and showed us how it's done. May your dreams be of gentle snowfalls and toasty hearths, and may you wake to a world where winter is more friend than foe. As the weak winter sun struggled to pierce the leaden grey clouds, the people of medieval Europe shivered and drew their meagre cloaks tighter about their shoulders. The icy tendrils of winter's grasp seemed to creep into the very marrow of their bones, chilling them to the core. For the poorest peasants, the cruel irony was that their ragged woolen garments, which felt so oppressively hot and sticky in the sweltering labours of summertime, now provided scarcely more warmth than a gossamer veil against winter's biting onslaught. They huddled together in their hovels, thankful for the meagre heat thrown by a smoky fire, their breath misting in the chilly air. The animals felt winter's bite too. The elderly draught horse, ribs protruding beneath its shaggy coat, dreamed wistfully of the long-gone lush summer grass as it ate its apportioned wisp of hay. The milk cow lowed mournfully, her teats chapped and raw in the frigid draughts that knifed through the barn walls. Even the wily barn cats looked a bit less haughty, their usual disdain blunted by the gnawing in their bellies and the frost on their whiskers. Yes, winter was an especially trying time for the lowest rungs of medieval society. But even the nobility, cocooned in their grand, draughty castles, were far from immune from the deprivations of the season. Many a blue-blooded maiden wailed in despair as her priceless silk gowns proved useless against the dank chill of stone walls. The castle kitchens strained to concoct enough piping hot delicacies to stoke the noble innards. It is said that King Henry II of England, felled by a severe case of the winter shivers, once burned an entire chair just to warm his royal posterior for a blessed moment or two. His servants despaired, knowing His Majesty's temper was liable to ignite even faster than the furniture if he remained uncomfortably cold for long. But for peasant and king alike, winter seemed to grind on interminably, an unrelenting slog of frozen misery. The only respite came from the occasional celebration or feast day, brief islands of revelry in the dark ocean of winter. The people seized upon these moments of light and levity, cherishing them like a drowning man gasping for air. Perhaps the most anticipated was the Feast of St. Stephen on December 26th, a day of unbridled merriment and delightfully subversive reversals of fortune. By ancient tradition, a mere peasant was crowned the Lord of Misrule on this day, gleefully lording over his betters in a delicious bit of sanctioned rebellion. One can only imagine the raucous peals of laughter that rang out as the lowliest serf ordered about the local baron with mock imperiousness. For one glorious day, the normal rules and hierarchies fell away, and all revelled together as equals. The frigid drudgery of winter seemed to recede, driven back by the bright blaze of communal joy. But soon enough, the merry festivities would end. The misrule would be righted, and the cold, hard reality of winter would descend once more. The people would trudge back to their hearths and their chores, the bite of the wind seeming to mock the fleeting warmth of fellowship. The battle against winter's grim siege resumed, unabated. And yet, even in the bleakest depths of winter, there were quiet acts of courage and compassion that melted the hoarfrost from even the most careworn hearts. Neighbours shared scarce provisions with those even less fortunate, exhibiting a generosity of spirit that no cold could diminish. A certain Dame Matilda of York was said to have once given her only cloak to a poor beggar woman, shivering herself through the long walk home. When questioned why she would relinquish her one defence against the brutal cold, she simply smiled serenely and said, "The warmth of human kindness is a fire that never goes out." Such selflessness, such nobility of spirit, was the secret weapon with which the medieval people armed themselves against winter's relentless battery. For though winter could freeze their fingers and toes, it could not touch the invincible summer that reigned eternal in their hearts. And so they endured, they persisted, they triumphed in their own way over the harshest of seasons. The first green buds of spring were more than just a welcome sight. They were a living testament to the tenacity of the human will, the indomitable spirit that could outlast any winter, no matter how dark or cold. As we snuggle deeper under our cozy electric blankets, perhaps we would do well to remember the trials and triumphs of our medieval forebears. For in their unending battle against the elements, in their stubborn refusal to bow before nature's capricious fury, they forged a legacy of resilience that warms us still today. The chill winds of winter may still moan outside our windows, but we can draw strength from the knowledge that if they could brave the brutal cold with naught but a cloak and their unquenchable human spirit, well, then surely we can survive until spring arrives once more. Spring at last. As the icy grip of winter finally began to loosen, medieval folk eagerly awaited the return of fairer weather. They had endured months of bitter cold, huddling in cramped quarters, stomachs growling from meager winter rations. But now, as the sun lingered a bit longer in the sky each day, glinting off the melting snow, there was cause for celebration. Across the land, people emerged from their winter cocoons, blinking in the bright spring light like bears stumbling out from hibernation. Children burst out of their homes, delighting in the feel of fresh breezes on their faces, instead of the stinging bite of winter wind. With giddy laughter, they ran through the squelching mud, marveling at the first brave crocuses poking their petals through the thawing ground. In the fields, farmers eagerly awaited Plough Monday, the traditional start of the agricultural year. Occurring on the first Monday after Epiphany, it marked the moment when the ground had softened enough for ploughing to begin. Draft horses and oxen would be hitched to ploughs and paraded through the village streets, decked out in garlands and brightly coloured ribbons. Church bells pealed joyously as the procession passed, a festive start to the growing season ahead. There was a palpable sense of relief as chimneys puffed with smoke once more, no longer choked with snow and ice. The threat of frostbite and illness receded along with the snowbanks. Faces creased with care from the stresses of winter survival, now crinkled into hopeful smiles instead. Soon, vibrant spring and summer produce would replace the bland preserved gruel and hard cheese that had barely sustained them through the long, dark months. It's perhaps difficult for us to imagine from our modern vantage point just how momentous this seasonal shift was. We may grumble about slushy roadways or groan at losing an hour of sleep to daylight savings time. But for our medieval forebears, the arrival of spring was nothing short of life-affirming. It meant they had weathered winter's brutal assault, staving off starvation and sickness for one more year. The skeletal trees cloaking themselves in green once more was an outward reflection of the inner regrowth and renewal medieval people felt as warmth and light returned. Some of that elation can still be heard echoing through the ages in lively medieval folk tunes and verses that welcomed spring's sweet return. One English song jauntily proclaimed, "Lud sing cuckoo, groweth said and bloweth med, and springeth the woad new. Sing cuckoo," which roughly translates to, "Loudly sing cuckoo." The seed is growing and the meadow is blooming and the wood is springing up anew. Sing, cuckoo. The sheer, irrepressible joy is palpable, spilling out in simple yet evocative rhyme. So let us take a moment to appreciate the immense fortitude, resilience, and zest for life embodied by our medieval ancestors. Through the harshest conditions imaginable, they endured, making it through each winter by the grit of their teeth and the bonds of their communities. And when spring sun and birdsong broke winter's oppressive silence at long last, they revelled wholeheartedly, knowing they had once again triumphed over nature's cruelty. As we nestle into our warm beds, perhaps grumbling half-heartedly about the chill outside our windows, we might spare a thought for those long-ago souls, the ones who would heave sighs of pure relief as the snow gave way to mud, flinging open their shutters and letting the spring air rush in. The ones who met winter's brutality with a tenacity and exuberant will to live that should humble us to this day. Let their strength be a reminder to us when we face our own bleak seasons, literally or metaphorically. If they could emerge from the depths of winter privation with such unabashed joy, then surely we too can find wellsprings of hope to sustain us. The thaw will come, the sun will return, and we will step out once more into the light. Voices joined in a resounding chorus of "Lud sing cuckoo." The blizzards and bitter frosts continued to torment the land, but medieval folk possessed a stubborn resilience. Even in the darkest depths of winter, they found ways to help each other weather the storm. Neighbours shared what meagre food they had, taking turns hosting communal meals. Villagers assigned young men to check on elderly widows, bringing them firewood and repairing their ramshackle huts. One such widow was Agnes, an old woman with no family to care for her. Her bones ached fiercely in the cold, and her hands trembled as she tried to kindle a fire, to no avail. She had nearly given up hope when there was a knock at her door. It was Tom, a strapping village lad, his cheeks ruddy from the biting wind. He brought not only an armful of logs, but a sack of dried peas and a haunch of salted pork, donated by other villagers. Tears of gratitude streamed down Agnes's wrinkled face as Tom stoked a roaring blaze in her hearth. For the first time in weeks, warmth seeped back into her frail body. Such acts of generosity were common in these lean times. The wealthy and even the nobility were not exempt from compassion. Lady Margaret, wife of the local earl, was known for her charity in winter months. Though her castle larders were well stocked, she insisted on sending wagons of grains and preserved foodstuffs to the poorest peasants in her husband's domain. Some of her highborn peers scoffed at this, viewing the peasantry as hardly better than the livestock. Why waste good food on them? But Lady Margaret held firm to her Christian duty to care for the less fortunate. One particular winter, famine hit the area hard. Lady Margaret worked determinedly to stretch the castle provisions, ordering the cooks to concoct hearty soups and stews to ladle out to the starving poor who came begging at the gates. The kitchen boys grumbled at the extra work, but the cook, a portly fellow named Bernard, shared his mistress's sense of noblesse oblige. He threw himself into the task, bulking out the soup with every last turnip and potato in the cellar. The ravenous peasants gratefully slurped it down, heedless of the gristly bits of mutton floating in the gruely broth. For some, it would be their only meal for days. As winter dragged on, even Lady Margaret's coffers began to run low. She took to quietly selling some of her jewels and finery to buy more supplies from neighbouring towns. Her husband, the Earl, chose to look the other way, respecting his wife's piety, even as he worried it would leave them vulnerable to lean times themselves. The church too played its part in aiding the suffering. Monasteries opened their doors to the poor and infirm, offering them a warm pallet of straw to sleep on and a basic daily meal of bread and ale. Some even ran primitive hospitals to nurse the frostbitten and desperately ill. The monks saw it as their holy duty, a way to emulate the selfless compassion of Christ. Brother William was a young novice tasked with tending to the sick at his monastery's hospital. Though the sights and smells of disease and decay turned his stomach, he forced himself to ladle broth into the mouths of toothless elders and change the pus-soaked bandages of weeping sores. He prayed fervently for the strength to endure this trial and thanked God that his station in life spared him the worst ravages of winter. For winter was the great equalizer, laying low rich and poor alike with its icy scythe. Certainly the wealthy could afford thicker woolen hose and luxuries like hot mulled wine, but they still shivered in their draughty manners and worried over their winnowing stores. And death came for them too, in the form of winter-borne disease. The noblewoman Lady Isabel was heavily pregnant during a particularly vicious cold snap. Sequestered away in her confinement chamber, she had every comfort: a crackling hearth, mounds of furs, and attentive maids to cater to her every need. But contagion has a way of sneaking past even the thickest castle walls. A kitchen girl with a hacking cough brought Lady Isabel a posset of warm milk and herbs. Within days, the expectant mother was burning with fever, her lungs rattling. The child came too soon, a tiny wisp of a thing that never drew breath. By week's end, Lady Isabel too was dead. The king himself was not immune. Henry VI, a pious and gentle soul, fretted endlessly over the suffering of his subjects during the dreadful winter of 1433. The royal physicians prescribed him a tonic of cinnamon and ginger to ward off the cold humours, but still he sank into a deep melancholy, unable to warm his hands, even when thrust practically into the roaring hearth. Some whispered it was God's punishment for Henry's weakness as a ruler. In truth, seasonal depression was an affliction that could strike any man, from mightiest king to lowliest serf. As the days slowly began to lengthen and the tightly clenched fist of winter finally started to loosen, people allowed themselves to dream of spring. Soon, they prayed, the land would thaw and the first tentative buds would appear on the skeletal trees. The great wheel of the farming year could begin to turn once more. In the earliest days of spring, on the first Monday after Epiphany, medieval folk celebrated Plough Monday. This was when the first symbolic furrow would be cut into the frost-spangled earth, a hopeful portent of the crops to come. Village men blackened their faces with soot for luck and paraded through the muddy lanes with their ploughshare held high, singing bawdy songs to wake the slumbering soil. Afterward, there was dancing and hearty food, and much quaffing of ale. It was a promise, a covenant, that the dark days of winter were passing and brighter tomorrows lay ahead. The same eternal cycle played out at all levels of society. In the great halls of dukes and countesses, minstrels struck up a merry tune and couples leapt into a lively carol dance, flush with the optimism of a new year. The king hosted a lavish feast for his court, the tables heaped with delicacies like roast swan and marchpane sweets. Even the lowly peasant Giles and his brood felt a weight lift from their shoulders as they ventured out to their humble plot. Giles clutching the pouch of precious saved seed that meant a future of full bellies. The wretched widow Agnes, who had been knocking on death's door, found herself stirring a bubbling pot of pottage, humming tunelessly. She had made it through winter's gauntlet to see another spring dawn. Praise be to God. Winter was brutal, there was no escaping that fact. It brought with it a host of miseries and hardships, from hunger to bone-chilling cold, to the constant spectre of death and disease. But it was also a time when the true resilience and communal spirit of medieval people shone through. Staring into the abyss of winter bleakness, they responded with generosity, with grit, and even with defiant celebration. They understood that winter was an inescapable part of the great cycle of life, and the best way to conquer the cold was to hunker down and endure it together. So as you huddle beneath your cozy duvet, perhaps grumbling about the exorbitant heating bill or scraping a bit of frost from your windshield, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors. Reflect on how they survived winter after winter in a world before electric blankets, central heating, and grocery deliveries at the click of a button. Though our modern winter woes may seem all-consuming in the moment, they pale in comparison to what medievals faced each year. And perhaps we could learn a lesson from them, that empathy, charity, and an irrepressible hope for spring are the best ways to weather the hardships life throws our way, whether it be a polar vortex or a pandemic. Let us all embrace the coming spring with a full and grateful heart, knowing that however deep the snow drifts, it will eventually yield to the warming sun. The harshness of winter only makes the blossoming of spring all the sweeter. And so, as a medieval king might say, let us winter bravely, so that we may spring eternally. Frost crackles underfoot as you trudge through snowdrifts, breath clouding in the icy air. Icicles glitter in the pale sunlight, hanging from the eaves of wattle and daub huts. The village lies hushed and still, huddled against winter's onslaught. This is what winter looked like for most of our medieval ancestors. Not the cozy scenes we imagine of merry feasts in snug castles decked with holly and buzzing with music and laughter. No, for the vast majority, winter was a time of bone-chilling cold, gnawing hunger, and grim survival. The spectre of winter hunger was never far away. With crops withered and livestock scarce, putting food on the table became a daily battle. Grain stores dwindled, and bitter herbs and shriveled turnips were soon all that stood between a family and starvation. One bitterly cold winter in 1315, a medieval English manor's harvest fell short by a third due to storms and freezing weather. The desperate serfs were reduced to eating the straw roofs off their huts and boiling the leather from their shoes, all the while still forced to labour for their lofty lords. Malnutrition weakened the body's defences against winter maladies. The common cold could quickly morph into life-threatening pneumonia or bronchitis. Influenza cut through villages like a scythe, felling young and old alike as they shivered in their shabby shelters. With teeth chattering, medieval folk huddled together against the chill, packing into the relative warmth of shuttered houses. Yet this close-quartered coziness came at a cost. The stale, smoky air, ripe with the odours of unwashed bodies, festering chamber pots and dirty rushes, was a breeding ground for disease. In one 14th century Suffolk household, 13 family members from grandparents to babes in arms, along with their scrawny chickens and mangy dogs, huddled together in a single tiny smokehouse all winter. It's incredible that any emerged alive come spring. Sickness was not the only danger lurking in the long dark nights. Fires were a constant threat in packed wooden cities and towns. One misdirected spark could swiftly grow into a furious blaze, hungrily devouring tightly clustered buildings and snuffing out lives. The Great Fire of London in 1212 started on a cold November night, quickly raging through the city's cramped lanes, while water froze in the pipes. An estimated 3,000 huddling Londoners perished in the flames, and many more were left homeless in winter's icy grip. Travel was especially treacherous in these frigid months. Roads dissolved into muddy quagmires, while blizzards obscured the way with blinding flurries. With daylight scarce, travellers risked becoming disoriented and losing their way, stumbling from the path to a frozen grave. In 1311, the English Queen Isabella set out from Canterbury for London as the winter twilight deepened on the shortened day. Her party lost the road and wandered helplessly until the early hours, while the pregnant queen wept copiously in fear and exhaustion. Winter's onslaught was no less punishing for working animals. Horses and oxen grew gaunt and weak on scant winter feed. Their laboured breaths smoked in the chill air as they hauled logs and packs through knee-deep snow. Frostbite blackened extremities and ice cracked hooves and wheel spokes alike. Yet even in the bleak depths of winter, medieval people found slivers of light. The Feast of St. Stephen, or Boxing Day as we know it today, was a time of charity and goodwill. Alms boxes in churches overflowed with offerings for the poor, while lords supplied hearty meals to cold and hungry tenants. The Lord of Misrule tradition brought a spark of subversive festivity to the darkest days. A lowly peasant, jester or deacon, would be crowned king and preside over merry revels marked by drunkenness, role reversals and mischief, a temporary upending of the established order. Despite the privations and dangers medieval winters posed, hope somehow endured, etched in frosty breaths and no doubt uttered as fervent prayers. Hope that the weak and ailing would survive, that food would last until spring, that light and warmth would conquer the constricting cold once more. So this winter, when you grumble about shoveling the driveway, curse at the thermostat, or get chilled waiting for the bus, spare a thought for those who came before us. Our medieval ancestors faced the Herculean task of surviving winter after winter with few of the comforts we take for granted. Their quiet courage in the face of winter's cruelty is perhaps the greatest lesson they have to teach us. Though we will never know most of their names or stories, we can appreciate the magnitude of their struggles and find inspiration in their endurance that saw them through to brighter days. The bitter frost continued its icy reign, transforming the landscape into a crystalline wonderland that would be picturesque if not for the immense hardship it inflicted on the inhabitants of the land. The snow fell ceaselessly from the ash-grey sky, blanketing the countryside in a suffocating white shroud. Icicles hung like glittering daggers from the eaves of peasant hovels and grand manors alike. The hearth fires that burned day and night offered only a fleeting respite from the penetrating chill. Smoke from the precious flames stung watering eyes and choked lungs in the close, fetid air of wattle and daub huts. There, huddled bodies crammed together for warmth, humans and livestock alike, the pungent aromas of dung and unwashed flesh mingling together into a uniquely medieval winter perfume. For some, however, even this dubious comfort was a luxury they could ill afford. Scant food stores stretched precariously thin, and bellies rumbled with the persistent pangs of hunger. Many of the poorest subsisted on little more than coarse bread and thin gruel, praying they would survive to see the spring. The spectre of famine lingered in every home, from lowly serf to high lord. None could escape winter's deadly grasp, not even those who wore crowns. In drafty stone castles that seemed to inhale the cold and exhale an unrelenting damp, rulers shivered beneath mountains of furs. Royal households required vast amounts of firewood and provender to ride out the long winter months. Woe to the kingdom whose sovereign failed to plan ahead. According to one account, a medieval Bohemian princess perished from the cold in her bedchamber. Her demise, a chilling reminder that wealth and status offered only partial protection from the elements. But for a peasant family, the loss of a loved one to winter's icy scythe was all too common, an occurrence as cruel as it was predictable. Disease added to the season's prodigious death toll. Agues and fevers spread like wildfire through communities weakened by malnutrition and close quarters. The stale, smoky air of hovels and the ubiquitous filth made the lungs more vulnerable to infection. Medieval physicians, their useless treatments, often rooted more in superstition than science, could do little. The roads, treacherous with snowdrifts and black ice, compounded the winter's woes. Only the desperate or the foolhardy ventured far from the meagre comfort of their homes in the darkest months. Travel for any distance was an ordeal to be undertaken at one's peril. Peddlers' carts remained idle, depriving isolated villages of needed goods. Tithes and taxes went uncollected, to the vexation of liege lords and clergy. And woe to the army that had to mount a campaign over snow-choked roads, their supply lines stretched taut and fraying in the frigid weather. The winter of 1407 saw one of the Middle Ages' most astonishing military feats, born of this brutal necessity for wintry warfare. The redoubtable Welsh rebel leader, Owain Glyndwr, faced off against the superior forces of future King Henry V in the high mountain passes. Glyndwr's men, accustomed to harsh conditions, drew the English into a trap amid the blinding blizzard. Hapless in their heavy armour, the English ranks broke and fled, with many perishing from exposure. Glyndwr's stunning victory, won as much by the winter as by Welsh martial prowess, lives on in legend to this day. The winters of medieval Europe were often marked by devastating famines that claimed countless lives. When the cold lingered and spring planting was delayed, food shortages quickly followed. The infamous Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was sparked by an unusually wet and chilly spring that rotted seedlings in the ground. Successive crop failures over the next 2 years plunged much of the continent into starvation. In England, the price of bread skyrocketed to 20 times the normal cost. The poor resorted to eating grass, roots, even the bark off trees. Desperate bands of scavengers dug up graves to cannibalize the dead. It's estimated 10 to 25% of the population of cities like Ypres and Bruges in modern-day Belgium perished. In the French town of Tournai, a citizen wrote in his diary that the poor were eating dogs, horses, and other unclean things. The misery was compounded by crime and disease, as malnourished citizens turned to theft and violence to survive. One heart-rending account from the St. Mary's Abbey Chronicles relates the fate of a starving woman imprisoned for stealing a loaf of bread. The woman was pregnant and starving, but the baker would give her no bread, so she stole a loaf and was caught. The judges would not pardon her, so she was hanged. As she died, the infant fell from her womb before the eyes of the people. The child lay bloody and screaming on the ground, but no one wanted to touch or rescue it, and the baby soon died where it fell. The famine finally eased in 1318 when the weather turned favourable again and crops began to grow. But the spectre of starvation stalked the land every winter, ready to reap a grim harvest at the slightest adversity. For medieval people, winter was always a time of gnawing unease, if not outright terror, as they prayed their meagre food stores would last until spring. Malnutrition weakened the populace and left them vulnerable to disease. The close, unsanitary living conditions of winter led to frequent outbreaks of infections like influenza, dysentery, and pneumonia. Respiratory illnesses especially took a heavy toll, spread by coughing in stale, smoky air as people huddled around fires. Something as simple as a winter cold could quickly turn deadly in the Middle Ages. Even the doctors of the era were of little help, relying on dubious treatments like bleeding and purging with laxatives to restore the balance of a patient's humours. The Emperor Charlemagne allegedly died of pleurisy in the bitter winter of 814, after his doctors treated him with poultices and unguents to no avail. Many historians believe the Black Death of the 14th century spread so quickly because malnourished citizens packed together in winter quarters had little resistance to the disease. The 1348 to 1349 outbreak killed a staggering 30 to 60% of Europe's population. One poignant tale comes from Pistoia, Italy, where a man named Ser Luca wrote to his brother Franceschino describing the devastation. "I am sick at heart and can barely bring myself to write, for things here go from bad to worse. Many are dead, and many more are dying. Shops are closed, taverns deserted. One passes down streets without meeting a soul. Wails of grief echo from houses where death has struck. The stench of rot rises from mass graves. I fear our city may soon be empty of life entirely. I beg you, stay where you are and pray for us unceasingly." As the plague raged, entire villages were wiped out. The suffering was compounded by the trauma of hasty mass burials in frigid ground and sick people expelled to die alone in the snow for fear of contagion. The devastating losses of the Black Death left deep psychological scars and forever altered the medieval world. Winter was an especially dreaded time for the elderly, young children, and expectant mothers. Without the benefits of modern medicine, these vulnerable populations frequently succumbed to cold, disease, or malnourishment. It's estimated that in some medieval societies, up to 20 to 30% of infants died within their first year of life, many during the harsh winter months. Complications of pregnancy and childbirth, exacerbated by poor diet and chilly conditions, claimed the lives of countless mothers and babies. The perils of winter childbirth are illustrated by the sad tale of Matilda, the 12-year-old daughter of King Henry I of England. In the winter of 1120, Matilda was aboard a ship called the White Ship, sailing from France to England. The ship hit a rock and quickly sank, sending Matilda and hundreds of other passengers into the frigid waters of the English Channel. Matilda nearly escaped drowning by getting into a small rescue boat, but then cried out for her half-brother William, who was still in the water. When the boat rowed back to get William, so many desperate people tried to climb in that it capsized, casting Matilda back into the cold waves. The king's young daughter, pregnant with her first child, perished along with the rest. Her grief-stricken father was said to have fainted dead away at the news and never smiled again for the rest of his life. The very old and very young were always in peril during the bleak winters of the Middle Ages. If they managed to survive disease and starvation, they still might freeze to death in their sleep. The medieval poem, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, contains a chilling, no pun intended, description of the elderly King Arthur shivering beneath his robes in a draughty castle hall, so cold his teeth chattered as he spoke. Without the insulating ice caps and glaciers we have today, winters in the Middle Ages were accompanied by raging snowstorms and devastating floods. In 1216, King John of England supposedly lost the crown jewels while crossing a marshy area in East Anglia called the Wash. Fleeing enemies in rebellion against his rule, John's baggage train was swallowed up by a surging high tide, whipped up by fierce gales. The king allegedly escaped by the skin of his teeth, but his treasure, including priceless jeweled crowns and scepters, disappeared into the churning waters, never to be seen again. John died of dysentery a few days later, a broken man. Some historians believe the loss of the crown jewels was the final blow that sent an ailing John to his grave. Winter storms often meant disaster for coastal communities battered by hurricane-force winds and massive waves. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records a terrible flood that struck England in 1099. On St. Martin's Day, the 11th of November, came a great sea flood through the length of this land, and overran it so far as no man remembered that it ever did before, and drowned many towns and a countless number of people. Another North Sea flood on January 16th, 1219, completely submerged the low-lying Netherlands, killing over 50,000 people. In an era with no early warning systems or emergency shelters, the population was completely at the mercy of the elements. All medieval folk could do was pray for deliverance as icy floodwaters rose and the wind howled like the very hounds of hell outside their frail homes. Harsh winters also meant an increase in fires as people did whatever they could to keep warm. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle again gives a chilling account of a deadly London blaze in 1132. A dreadful fire broke out on London Bridge and spread so rapidly that before it could be extinguished, it burned down a great part of the city, with the principal church of St. Paul and the Cathedral of Canterbury, besides many other churches and houses. The force of the wind and the violence of the flames carried burning rafters and sheets of lead from the roofs an extraordinary distance. With most buildings made of timber and tightly crammed together, it's no wonder medieval cities were such tinderboxes. A stray spark or overturned candle could ignite an unstoppable inferno, especially when gale-force winter winds whipped the flames into a frenzy. People fled through narrow, twisting streets as their homes burned behind them, often with little more than the clothes on their backs. There are countless tragic stories of families separated in the chaos, children trampled, and people trapped and burned alive. Given the limited firefighting technology of the era, often all citizens could do was throw buckets of water or snow on the flames and pray the wind would shift before the entire city burned. The devastation could be near total, leaving thousands homeless and destitute in the dead of winter. But perhaps the greatest danger of medieval winter was something that required no great blizzards, floods, or conflagrations. Sometimes the simple, inescapable, life-sucking cold was enough. It's hard for us to imagine in our modern world of central heating and thermal fabrics, but the bone-chilling damp and constant dark of winter was an adversary from which there was little defense in the Middle Ages. With only smoky fires and piles of furs to ward off the chill, winter cold sank deep into the bones of medieval people. Arthritis and rheumatism were common afflictions, the pain growing worse with every passing year. Extremities slowly went numb, then black with frostbite. Pneumonia and influenza ran rampant in close quarters. The cold seemed to seep into the very soul, sapping all energy and vitality. The 6th century British monk Gildas paints a grim picture in his work, On the Ruin of Britain. The nights are long and dark, the days dreary and chill. The air bites with malice, the icy blasts cut to the bone. All is blanketed in snow and frost. It is a time of great suffering for man and beast alike, when all the earth seems dead and frozen, locked in the clutches of a frigid hell. For the elderly and frail especially, winter was a time of dread, marked by a hopeless feeling that the warmth might never return. People piled on every article of clothing and huddled together for warmth, but still the cold crept in. Fires sputtered and died in the damp, leaving only plumes of acrid smoke that stung the eyes and choked the throat. Coughs and sniffles echoed in the darkness, interspersed with the groans of the sick and dying. The cold kept its icy grip round the clock, turning exhalations to frost and numbing appendages. It seemed to reach icy fingers into the chest, squeezing the breath and congealing the blood. Even the young and healthy moved as if through deep water, sluggish and yielding. There was no escaping winter's clutches in the Middle Ages, no Florida vacations or cozy electric blankets to take the edge off. The cold was a constant, merciless companion, sapping precious energy needed for survival. It's no wonder the medieval world measured the passage of time not in months or years, but in how many winters one managed to survive. To make it through to another spring was a triumph, one that grew more difficult with each passing season. But somehow, despite the brutal conditions, the rampant disease, the gnawing hunger, and the life-stealing cold, the people of the Middle Ages endured. Year after year, winter after merciless winter, they shouldered on, armored only in their indomitable spirits. When the last meager stores of food ran low, they tightened their belts another notch. When the fire burned down to embers, they drew another tattered blanket close. And when the dark pressed in from all sides, they huddled together and whispered stories of brighter days to come. There is a moving passage in the 14th century English poem Piers Plowman that captures the sheer resilience of the medieval spirit. Through woe and winter's bale, frost and snow and sleet and hail, all shall pass and peace prevail, hope shall triumph and never fail. Even in the darkest depths of winter, medieval folk found small joys and moments of grace. Neighbours shared what little they had with those who had even less. Amid the cold and dark, people came together to sing and pray. At night, some swore they could hear the voices of angels in the howling winds, promising that warmth and light would come again. And so the people of the Middle Ages held fast to hope, clung fiercely to life, and kept their eyes fixed on the far horizon where spring lay in wait. They knew in their bones that winter, no matter how brutal and unrelenting, was always a temporary state. The sun would return, the snows would melt, and the world would be reborn, as green and glorious as if winter had never come at all. All they had to do was endure, and endure they did, with a strength forged in the very ice and stone of the season. The winters of the Middle Ages were brutal, merciless, and seemingly endless. They brought hunger, disease, destruction, and death. But they also brought out the best in the human spirit, the unshakable will to survive, to hold fast to hope, to come together in compassion and kindness. The medieval world was tempered in winter's icy crucible and emerged stronger for it, a little tougher, a little wiser, with a bone-deep appreciation for the turning of the seasons. So perhaps we can learn a lesson from our medieval forebears as we grumble about scraping a few inches of frost from our windshields. For them, winter was a matter of life and death, a season to be survived with gritted teeth and unshakable resolve. And survive they did, passing down to us their tales of a winter's wrath and the invincible power of the human spirit. In the dead of our modern winters, May we remember their fortitude and find in it the inspiration to shoulder through our own dark days. The people of the Middle Ages stared winter full in its icy face and refused to yield. They endured floods and famine, blizzards and blackest night. They buried their dead in frozen ground and woke to the groans of the starving. But always, always they held fast to the promise of spring. And if they could make it through winter after winter with little more than faith and furs, then surely we can find the strength to face our own battles, knowing that the thaw will come and light will return. The brutal winters of the medieval world may be long past, but their lessons echo through the ages, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. So let us walk in the footsteps of our ancestors and meet winter's chill with courage, compassion, and unshakable hope. For if they could brave the darkest season with heads unbowed, then so too can we. Winter is coming, but spring, as the medieval world knew so well, is never far behind. As the chilling winds howled across the frozen landscape, medieval folks gathered round the flickering light of the hearth fire. Huddled together for precious warmth, they shared tales of winters past, those harsh and unforgiving seasons that tested the mettle of even the hardiest souls. In humble cottages and grand manor houses alike, the sting of winter's icy breath knew no bounds. Drafty shutters and thin thatched roofs offered scant protection against the relentless cold. From peasants to princes, all felt the bite of Jack Frost nipping at their noses and numbing their extremities. But some were fortunate enough to have a roaring hearth around which to cluster. The crackle of the flames and the aroma of smoke offered small comfort against winter's onslaught. In the castles of the highborn, great hall fireplaces consumed prodigious quantities of wood, attended by shivering servants whose labours never ceased. But even the mightiest noble shuddered to venture beyond the fire's glow, for winter's chill had a way of penetrating even the thickest stone walls and richest furs. For those of low birth, the season brought an especially grim and arduous struggle for survival. Their rough-hewn hovels boasted precious little in the way of creature comforts. Meagre rations of peat or wood scavenged from the forest barely fed the spluttering hearth. Families crammed together in squalid quarters, sharing body heat and breathing air thick with smoke and the fetid stench of unwashed humanity. It was a bleak existence, to be sure, and yet even in the face of such privations, there were moments of cheer to be found. The glow of communal fires in the village square drew folks out of their hovels, if only for a short respite. Gathered round the leaping flames, neighbours exchanged jests and jibes, stories and songs. For a fleeting time, the cruel realities of winter seemed distant indeed. Young lovers stole secret kisses, their ardour undimmed by the cold. Children shrieked with delight as they scampered and slid across frozen ponds. Even the elderly felt the weight of their years lift for a spell, transported back to the carefree winters of their youth. Such interludes of merriment were all the more precious for their rarity. Winter's onslaught was relentless and unforgiving. Thoughts soon turned to empty bellies and the gnawing hunger that was the constant companion of the poor. Dreams of spring's bounty seemed a cruel mockery as fields lay barren beneath a blanket of snow. The spectre of famine loomed large in these lean times. A failed harvest could spell doom for entire villages. Many a mother watched in anguish as her child's cheeks grew gaunt and their eyes dulled with the hollow stare of starvation. The cruel calculus of scarcity bred a special kind of desperation. Tales abounded of the depraved lengths to which some would go to fill their bellies, unnatural acts that haunted the nightmares of pious folk, and hunger was not the only scourge to stalk the land. Winter's chill breath bred a host of maladies that preyed upon the weakened populace. The hacking cough of pneumonia echoed through many a hovel as loved ones looked on helplessly. The pox and flux raged unchecked, decimating entire families. The very old and very young were especially vulnerable. their frail bodies ill-equipped to weather winter's ravages. But perhaps the greatest cruelty was reserved for those forced to venture out into the teeth of winter's fury. Travelers risked life and limb on treacherous, ice-slicked roads. Many a hapless wayfarer met their doom, swallowed up by swirling blizzards or plummeting into deep snowdrifts. Their frozen corpses would not be discovered until the spring thaw, a grim reminder of winter's lethal power. Even the valiant knights, those stout warriors of the realm, were not immune to winter's depredations. Clad in their heavy armor, they made easy prey for the bone-chilling cold that crept into every chink and rivet. Numb hands made clumsy by frozen gauntlets fumbled with sword and shield. Once mighty chargers floundered in the deep snowdrifts as icicles formed on their heaving flanks. Great and small alike cursed the name of winter. In the halls of power, the crown weighed heavy on royal brows furrowed with care. For even a monarch could not decree the seasons to reverse their inexorable turn. The cost of keeping the court supplied with provender and firewood was staggering. Royal treasuries groaned beneath the strain as grasping merchants reaped handsome profits from the king's largesse. But for all the miseries it engendered, winter's reign was not eternal. Even in the depths of icy despair, folk clung to the promise of spring's sweet renewal. The joyous feast of Stephen offered a welcome reprieve from winter's woes. For one raucous day, the world turned upside down as a lowly peasant assumed the mantle of the Lord of Misrule. Drunken revelry and bawdy songs lifted spirits and lightened hearts. Laughter, that balm for the careworn soul, echoed through the frost-bitten land. In the fullness of time, winter's gelid grip began to loosen. Icicles dripped from the eaves as the strengthening sun worked its subtle magic. Snowdrops and crocuses pushed their way through the softening earth, delicate harbingers of winter's retreat. The land stirred with new life, shaking off the torpid slumber of the frozen months. Hearts lifted and voices raised in joyful celebration. The Feast of the Plough marked the triumphant return of spring's verdant splendor. Sleek oxen dragged gleaming plowshares through rich, dark earth as the cycle of planting and renewal began anew. The lean times of winter soon faded into memory as fields rippled with the green and golden bounty of the land. Looking back across the centuries, we marvel at the fortitude of our medieval forebears. Year after pitiless year, they endured winter's cruelties with a stoicism born of necessity. Their strength of spirit and unbreakable bonds of community were the secret of their survival. In the face of unimaginable hardship, they found pockets of hope and moments of shared humanity. So the next time we grumble about the inconvenience of a delayed flight or the indignity of slushy streets, let us pause and reflect. Our modern winter woes are but a shadow of what once was. In the tapestry of human history, the icy trials of the Middle Ages loom large. They serve as a reminder of our species' remarkable resilience and the preciousness of a warm hearth and a full belly. As we drift off to slumber, let us spare a thought for those who came before. In our dreams, perhaps we will catch a glimpse of their world, a harsher, crueler world than our own, and yet one in which the indomitable human spirit shone all the brighter for the darkness that surrounded it. Good night, and sweet dreams of gentle spring breezes to come. As the bitter chill of winter descended once more upon the weary lands of medieval Europe, for the poor peasants who scraped out a meager living from the soil, the very warmth and light seemed to retreat from the world, replaced by a deep aching cold that penetrated to the bone. With little more than rags on their backs and scant food in their bellies, they could do naught but shiver and suffer in their draughty hovels as the cruel winds howled just beyond their walls. The fortunate few with fireplaces and stores of wood might huddle together for warmth in the flickering glow, but for most, The only comfort was the shared body heat of family and livestock packed in close quarters, the fetid stench of unwashed bodies mingling with the steam of cattle breath. One can only imagine the coughs, the fevers, the agonizing aches that must have plagued them in the damp and crowded squalor. It's a wonder any emerged alive on the other side of winter's interminable reign. But even the highest-born nobles, for all their thick furs and grand feasts, were not immune to the icy grasp of the season. Great medieval castles, with their soaring stone walls and cavernous halls, became like vast refrigerators in wintertime. The chill seeped up from the floors and down from the ceilings until it saturated the very air, defying even the mightiest of blazing hearths to banish it. There are tales of royal winter woes to make one shudder in sympathy. In the 15th century, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, consort of King Edward IV of England, was said to have actually frozen to death in her own chambers one uncommonly frigid night. While records are murky and much embellished, one account claims that despite being swaddled in heavy robes and furs, the poor woman succumbed to the deep cold and was found in the morning frozen stiff as a board. Whether the story is true or not, it certainly illustrates the perilous nature of winter for even the most privileged. Kings and queens might avoid the gnawing hunger and squalid conditions of their low-born subjects, but in some ways the hazards of the season were a great equalizer. After all, royals could no more command the elements than they could live without air. The chill found its way into even the most luxurious of medieval bedchambers. And so, as the days grew shorter and the nights ever darker and more frigid, the whole of medieval society braced itself for the annual onslaught of winter's wrath. From the lowliest crofter to the loftiest lord, a sense of grim endurance seemed to settle upon the populace, a knowledge that the only way out was through. Stores of grains and salted meats were checked and rechecked, every scrap of wood and kindling jealously hoarded, and heavy woolen garments donned in stoic anticipation. The only spark of levity and hope in the whole bleak affair came with the Christmas festivities surrounding the Feast of St. Stephen on December 26th. For a few merry days, the normal social order was gleefully upended as a lord of misrule was appointed from among the peasantry to preside over a bawdy array of feasts, dances, games, and general mischief. With bellies full of ale and wine, faces flushed from the press of bodies, and the exertions of revelry, the common folk could, for a brief shining moment, forget the long privations of winter and revel in the joys of life and community. One can imagine the scenes of boisterous celebration erupting in halls and public squares across the land, the raucous laughter, the wheezing of reed pipes and fiddles, as the people capered about in a whirling kaleidoscope of colour and mirth. For once, serf and nobleman mingled freely, the usual lines of class and station erased in the spirit of goodwill and fellowship. The lord of misrule, perhaps a puffed-up young peasant lad with stars in his eyes, issued grandiose proclamations and ridiculous decrees to the delight of all. It must have been a heady thing, that burst of misrule and saturnalia amid the bleakness. But as with all things, the festive season was but a temporary respite, the eye of the storm. As the Yule log burned down to embers and the last wassail bowl was drained, the people drifted back to their hearths, and the aching cold darkness once more descended. The gaiety of St. Stephen's Day and the Lord of Misrule's brief, shining reign were replaced again by the grim business of survival as winter tightened its grip. For the next interminable stretch of months, time seemed to slow to a frigid crawl. With the land frozen and unworkable, there was little for the rural peasantry to do but hunker down and pray for deliverance. The shortening days and lengthening nights yawned like a vast chasm from which there was no escape. Huddled together in their crude shelters against the killing cold, they must have despaired of ever again feeling the kiss of spring's warm breath upon their faces. But even the cruelest winter cannot last forever. and indeed the first greening shoots of new life were already straining up beneath the frozen ground, biding their time. For those who endured, who clung to hope and to each other through the darkest days and coldest nights, the thaw would come again. The sun would return to the sky, the blood quicken in the veins, the world slowly shed its greys and whites for a burgeoning riot of colour. On Plough Monday, just after Epiphany, the land could again be tilled, and the great wheel of the agricultural year would creak back into motion. The people would emerge, blinking, into the pale but gathering light of spring, leaner and deeply tired but alive and glad of it. Fields would be furrowed, seeds planted, flocks driven out to graze on new grass, and the whole merry dance of life would begin anew. But that was yet to come. For now, the cruel heart of winter beat on, and the people of the Middle Ages steeled themselves once more to weather its icy reign. They drew what comfort they could from their rough woolen cloaks, their smoky hovels, their scant stores of food so diligently laid by, but most of all from each other. In a world so beset by hardship and peril, where the very season seemed intent on crushing the life from their bones, they endured as they always had, together. Lords and peasants, young and old, shivering and hoping beneath the same leaden winter sky, waiting for the spring that must someday come. And so they hunkered down in the darkness and the cold, listening to the mournful howl of the wind and the groaning of the ice, spinning what tales and weaving what dreams they could to, while away the long winter nights. Perhaps they imagined a future where the winters were kinder, the hearths warmer, the bellies fuller. A world their shivering hands and frozen bones might build for the generations to come. Or perhaps they simply held fast to what scraps of light and hope they could muster in the moment, knowing that even the longest winter must someday yield to spring. In the face of such brutal conditions, the strength of the human spirit to endure and keep faith in brighter days ahead is truly a marvel. One cannot help but feel a swell of admiration for the fortitude of our medieval forebears, who faced each bitter winter as an indomitable foe and emerged, year after year, to greet the spring on the other side. Let us then tip our hats to those long ago lords and peasants, who suffered much and yet endured still more. In our modern world of central heating and on-demand grocery deliveries, it can be easy to forget the hardships they faced as a matter of course. But as we drift off to sleep in our warm beds, perhaps we can spare a thought for those huddled medieval masses and marvel at the strength that carried them through winter after winter, waiting for the light's return. In a world so often cold and dark, such enduring hope and resilience is a fire that cannot be quenched, burning on from their distant hovels to our own night-swaddled rooms. May we keep that flame alive in our hearts, come what winter may. As the long winter months dragged on, medieval folk looked forward to any opportunity to lift their spirits and foster a sense of community and goodwill amidst the hardships. One such beacon of hope was the Feast of St. Stephen, celebrated each year on December 26th. Though the origins of this midwinter celebration are somewhat obscure, by the Middle Ages it had become a cherished tradition across much of Europe. After the solemn religious observances of Christmas Day, St. Stephen's Day was a time for merrymaking, feasting, and the playful reversal of normal social roles. Central to the festivities was the custom of misrule, where a peasant or commoner would be appointed Lord of Misrule for the day and granted the power to command their social superiors. This light-hearted upending of the status quo provided a much-needed release valve for the rigid class tensions that normally dominated medieval life. The Lord of Misrule presided over a topsy-turvy day of revelry, leading raucous processions through the streets, initiating mischievous pranks, and decreeing that everyone from lords to labourers should make merry together. Professional entertainers like minstrels, jugglers and jesters would ply their trades, while games of chance and skill kept the crowds amused. Bawdy, comedic sketches called mummers' plays were performed, reenacting tales from legend and folklore in broad, exaggerated strokes. Mock jousts and farcical court proceedings induced peals of laughter, a welcome respite from the grim realities of winter life. Of course, no medieval celebration was complete without a hearty feast. On St. Stephen's Day, the Lord of Misrule could insist that the wealthy provide food and drink for the whole community, a charitable gesture that fostered goodwill and fellowship among all. Roasted meats were the centerpiece of the feast, from geese and capons to the traditional roast boar's head, marched in with great fanfare. Mincemeat pies, heavy with dried fruit and spices, offered a sweet treat, while the wassail bowl flowed freely, the warm spiced cider bolstering everyone's spirits. One can almost hear the laughter and lively chatter ringing through the halls, rising above the blustery winter winds outside. For one brief shining day, the hardships of winter faded into the background as the community came together in a spirit of joy and camaraderie. As the feast concluded and the revelers dispersed back to their hearths, they carried the warmth of the festivities with them, like a flicker of cheery firelight in the dark. The knowledge that they had friends and neighbours to rely on, that they could find moments of laughter and levity even in the bleakest times, surely helped buoy their spirits for the hard days still ahead. And somehow, the winter's icy grip seemed a bit less harsh, the howling winds a bit more bearable, when one had a belly full of good food and a heart full of fellowship. The Feast of St. Stephen was a timely reminder that even the deepest darkness of winter would eventually yield to the first hopeful stirrings of spring. Those fragile shoots of new life began to tentatively emerge as the winter snow receded and the frozen ground began to thaw. Across the countryside, watchful eyes eagerly scanned for the appearance of snowdrops, those valiant little flowers that poked their fresh green stalks and delicate white blooms through the melting slush. Their arrival heralded that the long night of winter was finally ending, and the season of rebirth approaching. In villages everywhere, weary folk rejoiced to see the first hints of colour and vitality return to a landscape that had been shrouded in icy white stillness for so many months. With a newfound spring in their steps, medieval peasants returned to the rhythms of the agricultural year, the great wheel of life beginning to turn once more. Hibernating livestock were led out to pastures starting to green again, while the farmer hitched his team to the plough, eager to churn the softening earth. The first Monday after Epiphany, falling in January, came to be known as Plough Monday for this very reason. It marked the moment when the land could be worked again after the winter freeze, inaugurating the labours of a new farming season. Ploughs that had been stored away for the winter months were hauled out and blessed in joyful Plough Monday processions through the fields, while ploughmen went from door to door collecting food, ale, and small coins, all in anticipation of the work and harvest to come. One can picture a weather-beaten village huddled around their communal plot, faces turned gratefully towards a sky, brightening into a paler shade of blue. With hoes and digging sticks in hand, they prepare to sink the first hopeful seeds into the receptive soil, an act of faith that spring would conquer winter in due time. Among them is the wizened old grandmother, a child clutching each gnarled hand as she shows them how to plant the peas, just as her own grandmother once taught her many long springs ago. The smaller child giggles with delight as a rotund earthworm wriggles free from the dirt, while the older solemnly pushes each seed into its waiting hollow. It was moments like this, where knowledge passed from old to young and growth bloomed anew, that made all the privations of winter worthwhile. The warm smile crinkling the grandmother's eyes holds the promise that the dark days have passed and life is returning to the land once more. As the seeds nestle into their earthen beds and the strengthening sun begins to coax green shoots from the ground, the spectre of winter finally releases its icy hold and slides away. The pall of cold and death that hung for so long eases, replaced by a spirit of hope and renewal carried on spring's gentle breezes. Looking back from our modern vantage point, it is sobering to reflect on the immense fortitude and resilience it must have taken to endure the brutal medieval winters year after year. With none of the amenities and comforts we often take for granted, their very survival through to spring was a feat worthy of marvel. And yet, in the midst of unimaginable hardship, medieval people still managed to find cause for hope, joy, and celebration. The warmth of community, the promise of spring, the restorative power of laughter and fellowship. These were the lights that guided them through winter's darkest depths. Perhaps, as we snuggle deeper under our cozy comforters, cozily insulated from the cold, we could spare a thought for our long-ago ancestors. The next time the winter wind rattles our windows and we grumble at the chill, we might pause and smile wryly, recognizing that our winter woes likely pale in comparison to what they faced year after year, century upon century. And as we drift off to sleep, we can carry the knowledge that we too possess an ember of that same invincible summer that burned in the hearts of medieval folk. The assurance that spring always returns and life goes on, no matter how dark the winter night. So as the last light fades and the wind whispers a lullaby against the pane, I invite you to let your imagination wander back through the ages, to walk alongside those distant ancestors as they triumphed over winter's icy reign. May their courage and indomitable spirit inspire your dreams tonight. And if this journey through history has piqued your curiosity, I encourage you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are always more boring tales to lull you into restful slumber. Until next time, my friends, sleep well and dream of cozy hearths and fresh green shoots stirring beneath the snow. Good night.